Hello, this is Dan Parr from graniteit.net. Welcome to this tutorial video on using Azure AD and SAML to authenticate Fortigate SSL VPN users. Traditionally, to authenticate VPN users, you would use LDAP or Radius, Radius being required if you needed to provide different levels of access to different groups of users. You would then configure your Radius server to pass back a vendor-specific attribute that matched the name of a group on the FortiGate. But what if you want to authenticate against Azure AD and make use of multi-factor authentication? Perhaps you've already got an investment in multi-factor authentication and Azure AD, using it for other applications in Office 365 and things, and you want to keep a familiar look and feel to all of your MFA for your users. This video will allow you to provide role-based access to users with full access to Azure AD and MFA. There are other solutions out there that make use of Radius, and there's an add-on for Microsoft's Network Policy Server, but these solutions are limited in the authentication methods that you can use and returning vendor-specific attributes for role-based access. So essentially, if you need to be able to enter in a one-time password, that will break the ability for Network Policy Server to be able to pass back that vendor-specific attribute, and all your users would wind up with the exact same access. I'm using FortiOS 7 on my lab appliance and a newly created Microsoft 365 trial tenant. However, the documentation does seem to exist for FortiOS 6.2 and higher. A prerequisite for doing SAML authentication and SSL VPN connectivity is to have a publicly trusted CA signed certificate on your FortiGate. This will be used, like I said, for SAML connectivity as well as VPN client connectivity. The best practice is to use a separate certificate for each service, but in my lab environment, I'm just going to use the one for both purposes. You can see here that I've created a certificate named VPN certificate, and it's signed by Let's Encrypt. A nice feature of FortiOS 7 is that you can create trusted free certificates using Let's Encrypt or other Acme-based providers that will automatically renew every 60 days. So that's nice. To manage your certificates, you need to navigate to System, Certificates. And if for some reason you don't see certificates under your system menu, you can click on Feature Visibility and make sure that you enable the certificates view. I'm going to link the documentation from both Fortinet and Microsoft in the video description below. However, what we're going to do in high level here is in Azure AD through the Admin Center, we're going to add an enterprise application. We're going to perform some SAML SSO configuration. We're going to download the certificate file that's generated for this application. And then we're going to configure some role groups and their user memberships. Then on the FortiGate, through the UI, we'll import that certificate that we downloaded from Azure. We're going to configure the SAML server through the CLI, along with the groups through the CLI as well. And then we're going to set up the SSL VPN and the required firewall policies. So here we are, the Azure Admin Center, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So in the Azure Admin Center, we're going to click on Azure Active Directory, and we're going to click on Enterprise Applications. And from here, we're going to make sure that we're on all applications, and we're going to add a new application. From the gallery, we can search for FortiGate, and we're going to select FortiGate SSL VPN. And then we'll say create. I'll give that a second to complete. So the application has been added successfully. So again, we'll click the breadcrumb for enterprise applications. I don't see it there. Let's try and see if we can get this. There it is. So within the application, we'll want to, first of all, click on single sign-on, and we're going to click SAML. And in here, we have a couple of locations where we're going to both place some information and retrieve some information. So in our basic SAML authentication, we're going to need to provide the identity or the identifier, the reply URL, the sign-on URL, and we'll apply the logout URL as well. In our user claims, we may need to have a look at this group claim. I've had some issues in the past where it just doesn't seem to be configured properly out of the gate. And we have a SAML signing certificate here that we're going to download for use on our FortiGate. And then we will collect these URLs under the Setup FortiGate SSL VPN section. So, according to the documentation, there are some URLs, and they're all listed here in this code block. What we need to do is replace this FortiGate IP address variable with the actual fully qualified domain name of our FortiGate. And we're also going to replace, or we're going to set the certificate name as well. So I'm going to replace this with remoteaccess.graniteit.net. There. So we have 3 good URLs, and we're also going to put set cert VPN cert. Just want to make sure, yes, that does match the certificate name. And we're going to take these entity, these URLs, and we're going to copy those one at a time into our SAML configuration. So we'll click Edit under Basic SAML Configuration. And you can see here as well, if you want to just manually type them in, they do provide the patterns that you would normally use in each field. So these two, the sign-on URL and the reply URL, are the same. So Once we've got all of those filled in, just going to delete that one because we just want this, the one in there, and it is set as default. We'll save that configuration. Okay, so we'll close out of there. And we're going to test later. Now, under our SAML signing certificate, we want to download the base 64 certificate. We'll save that file. And we want to take each of these URLs that are provided, and we're going to populate our code block. So we're going to copy the login URL, and that will go into the IDP single sign-on URL. And we want the IDP entity ID. So we will copy the Azure AD identifier. And we'll want the IDP single sign-on logout URL. Okay, now one thing to note is that these URLs are the same. That is not a typo. It just happens that that's the way that they appear now. And there is this IDP cert name and username variable that we're going to add. And we're also going to add the set group name, and it will be group. And so these names and the username and the group name are going to match attributes that are passed back in the SAML assertion. And they're based on these claims. Okay. So back on our Fortigate in our certificates page, we're going to import a remote certificate. And we will select the certificate that we just downloaded. We'll say OK. So this will create a certificate named remote_cert_1. In our code block, we want to match that name. Most CLI items, especially names of items in the Fortigate, are case sensitive. It looked as though the code block for defining the SAML server on the Fortigate was just about complete. But I did double check the documentation, and I did find a couple of things. One, I forgot a quote there, which would caused some issues pasting that in. To the username and group name. These are configured based on the claims defined in the enterprise application. So let me just find that here. Here we go. So it talks about the claims. So we need to create a new claim for username, and we're going to set the source attribute there as user principal name. And then we need to take the group claim and just ensure that it's set up properly. So in our claims, we're going to add a new claim, and we're going to name it username, and the source attribute, we will put it in as user principal name, and we're going to save that. Now here we have the group claim, and it displays a little bit differently. But if we double click on that, you can see that name is not filled in, and it's defined only for security groups. Now, in most cases, I believe that security groups would be just fine. That's normally what I would set up for role-based access. The documentation does say to set that to all groups. And the source attribute is going to be group ID. And in the name, we're going to customize the name, and we're going to call it group. The FortiGate is going to expect to receive these attributes in proper form. So we will go back to our SAML settings. We can see that we have a claim named group with user.groups, and we now have, now isn't that strange? Let's edit that again. Where did our username go? Username, drop the list, user principal name, attribute, save. We do see it here. Okay, so we do see both of our claims here as required. Now, so in our code block, we want to make sure that this matches username and group name equals group. So with those minor changes, we're all set. I'm going to copy this, go into our CLI for the Fortigate, and we will paste that code block in there. We can do a config user SAML and show full. That shows us our configuration is complete there. Now, our next step will be to ensure that we have access groups configured and that those users are provisioned to be able to access the application. We will say Here I have two test users, Peach Snapple and Turd Ferguson. We will take, and we also have two role groups. We have beverages and SNL characters. For each of these, we need to define those groups, a matching group on the FortiGate. And we're going to do that based on this object ID value. So let's take this, or I'll copy the object ID for the SNL characters, and I'm just going to make a note here in my notepad. SNL there, and the other group, beverages. Okay. So to define these groups, there's a separate code block. Actually, we can copy this. Okay. So what we want to do for each of these groups, we're going to give them a name. This can match, or it doesn't have to match your group name in Azure AD. We have defined our server name as SNL or SSL Azure SAML. So we will do the same. We will set the member here, and we'll set it in the matching as well. Paste, and then we need that group object ID. So this is AD SNL. We want the SNL group ID or object ID. And that will define that SNL group. Essentially, when somebody logs in through SSL VPN, if this group name or this group ID is returned as part of their SAML authorization from this defined SAML server, the FortiGate will assign them to this group. So we will do the same here. We're going to name this AAD beverages. We're going to, again, change the server name in 2 locations. And we're going to get this object ID for the beverages group. We don't need. So we have a code block here that will enter into the config user group. It will define the first group. It will then define the next group. So let's copy those, and we will paste that into our CLI. going to cancel that and get back to our root prompt. Now we will paste it and config user group show full. And you can see here there are a couple of local groups that have been defined. There is now an SNL group. And an AAD beverages group. So that should conclude our CLI work. Now, before moving forward, one thing that we do need to do is take a look at the enterprise application within Azure AD. We need to assign users and groups to allow them to use this application. So let's take a look at the users and groups. And we're going to add them. Now, we can add, and probably the easiest way to ensure that the users you enable for VPN get added, we can add these two groups. So all of your access groups. So, and here's a warning that when you add a group, only users directly in that group. So nested groups are a no-no, but you can add those role groups, and you shouldn't have nesting going on within those role groups. So we'll just assign our users. There we go. Okay. So that's taken care of. And I will just exit out of there. And we will move on to configuring our Fortigate UI and setting up our VPN. Meanwhile, back at the GUI interface for our Fortigate, we're going to configure our VPN. So from the Fortigate UI, you're going to navigate to VPN, and we're going to go to SSL VPN settings. So we have a number of predefined portals within our Fortigate. We have a full access tunnel that allows access through the web UI as well as tunnel mode. So you can go in through a web portal for your VPN, or you can also install the FortiClient and create a full SSL tunnel into the network. Then there are also a tunnel access portal that only allows tunnel access, and then a web access portal that only allows access through the SSL VPN web portal. In our VPN settings, there's a couple of warnings that show up right off the bat. There's no SSL VPN policies exist. If a policy doesn't exist for a user, they cannot log in. It's strange. You would expect that if their username and password is acceptable and accurate, that they would at least log in and then not be able to access anything. But the FortiGate actually does an intelligent lookup at the time of login to determine whether or not that user has access to anything. And if they don't, they're not allowed to log in. So we need to create some SSL VPN policies. There's also a warning here about using this built-in certificate. So there are a number of vulnerabilities that have been exploited using factory default certificates, training people to ignore certificate warnings or configuring client applications to ignore certificate warnings, generally bad practice. So they do requests that you add a new certificate. It also does mention this new Let's Encrypt feature, which is great. So we're going to go ahead and change that right now to our VPN cert. We can either manually configure a custom IP range, or we can allow the Fortigate to use a predefined range of IP addresses for VPN clients, DNS settings, and such. To permit users to log into the VPN, you need to map them to a portal. So, like I said before, the portals sort of dictate what methods a user has access to. So they can log into a web portal, and I believe that you can create custom web portals for different groups if you want, with different bookmarks and things inside them. Or there's tunnel mode. So what we're going to do, we're going to take both of our groups, and we're just going to tell them that they are able to access full access. So they can access through the default web portal, or they can access through the through tunnel mode. And we'll save that. Now, you notice we still have this warning about a policy. And again, in order to successfully authenticate and log in, a user has to be allowed to do something through a policy. So under policies and object firewall policy, we'll create a new policy, and we'll focus right now on the SNL group. We're going to say SNL VPN access. Our incoming interface is going to be our SSL VPN interface. Our outgoing interface, we're going to give Turd Ferguson access directly to our internal network, so that he can manage the FortiGate directly. And so for a source, we'll select all, because we don't really know what IP he's going to be assigned when he logs in through the VPN. But there's also, you'll see highlighted here, that one user or group is required. And this is what says that the SNL group that this policy applies to this group and not the beverages group. You could select multiple groups if you wanted, but we're just going to select SNL for right now. Click close, and our destination, for simplicity, we'll just say all. And for services, we're going to allow HTTP, HTTPS, and SSH. So the rest of the settings, I don't think we need NAT because they're both internal interfaces, and routing should be enabled between them. We're going to log all sessions just because I want to be able to troubleshoot if necessary. And we're going to show this enable policy. So policy is enabled. At this point, Turd Ferguson should be allowed to log in. So I'm just going to come back here to Azure AD. I want to just confirm that I don't misspell Turd's user principal name. Now, so I've switched over to my Windows sandbox here, and we're going to test this out. So we're going to HTTPS to remote access. This is a good sign. We're getting redirected to Microsoft's login page. We're going to paste in the Turd Ferguson email, and we log in. Reply URL in the request does not match the URLs configured for the application. Let's do a quick look.
So config user SAML, show full. Okay, so we have entity ID, remote access. So we have our log out. Let's have a look at that error message again. So the reply URL does not match the reply URL configured for the application. URLs configured for the application, so it says that it's this reply URL, remote access login, but the error message says that it's set to metadata. So it looks as though the problem was that their pattern here is incorrect. And when I keyed in, I didn't copy and paste everything, but I did test, or I used this and then I copied and pasted that. So I think that this should resolve our issue. There. So we can see that Turd Ferguson is able to log in to the SSL VPN portal. Let's try a quick connection just for laughs here. We can try an SSH session, and we will admin at 192.168.1.99. We'll try the internal management. And he is able to log in using SSH to the Fortigate. Show, let's see, config user SAML. And you can see the configuration that we made earlier. So we are successfully connected. This is good. Now, with the Fortin client VPN, I'm going to configure a new VPN connection, and we'll connect that to remote access.granite-it.net. We're going to actually okay, so we're going to put in a remote gateway IP. We're going to enable single sign-on, and we're going to select save. Oh, somehow I must have clicked the plus. Okay, so we have our login. We click the SAML login button, and you can see that we're redirected to a Microsoft 365 login. So we are connected through the FortiClient VPN. And although I can't test because I don't have an SSH client, we can try and do the https://192.168.1.99, and I've got my administration interface listing on port 4443. Took too long to respond. So let's just check our logs here. We can check for the event log, we can look at VPN events, and we can see that Turd Ferguson established a tunnel here, and the group assigned to that user is the AAD SNL group, and so policies should apply. Now, I'm not sure. No, I do know. Let's go back to our policy, firewall policy, and in here, we're going to add a new service, or we'll create a service, I'll just call it FGT MGMT, and we're going to we'll just call it this. We're going to make it TCP port 4443, and we'll create that service. We're going to allow that in the policy. So now it's here. Pop back. Turd's still connected. We're going to try and okay, so we're getting just a certificate error. That's fine because we're still using the self-signed certificate on the internal interface. Admin and yes, we are connected just fine. Now, we'll close my Windows sandbox. Our next step, let's create a new policy. This policy is going to be for beverages, SSL VPN, and from here we are going to allow ICMP. We're going to allow it from this interface. We're going to just say to my Starfleet VLAN, we're going to allow all user beverages, close. We're going to destination all, and we will then accept. We don't need the NAT. We're going to enable the policy. So we have a very basic policy here. This user can log in and send ICMP packets. That is not all that interesting. So let's see, Windows Sandbox. Okay, so I've got the FortiClient VPN installed on this Sandbox machine. We're going to log in. Again, it redirects us to our Okay, so now we're logged in as Peach Snapple. If we go back to our firewall here, let's take a look at our let's take a look at our logs, events, VPN events, and we can see that Peach Snapple is logged in and is a member of the AAD Beverages group. So from here, I'm going to ping 172.16.200.75. So this is that IP address belongs to a system on my network, a NAS device, and I am able to ping it from the VPN. Well, Peach Snapple is. Now, if we try https://192.168.1.99:4443, which Turd Ferguson was allowed to do, we can see that Peach Snapple cannot access that. I would like to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that it was educational and informative, but most of all, I hope it was helpful. If you would like to ask any questions, just comment below. I will do everything that I can to be of assistance. If there's a good response to this video, I'll try and make more helpful quality content. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more tutorials like this one. Thanks again. Have a great day.